Hey there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. This is Left Side of the Aisle. I'm Larry Erickson. You probably know all that by now. The next half hour, I got a couple of things I'm going to be talking about that I hope you'll be interested in. If you have any reactions to the show, you can, of course, email them to me directly to my personal email, which is Whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. Or go to my website, Lotus Surviving a Dark Time, with the URL around here, and you can leave a comment there, or you can get the email address from there if you'd rather. If you do send me email, as always, please include something in the subject line so it's clear this is not spam, and be a little patient about getting an answer. But with that, let's get on with it. Now, for this first thing, normally it's something I would say that I'm outraged, but these days, actually, I'm not. I'm frustrated and I'm depressed. I said last week that the attacks in Paris had generated old questions about what do we do now, which had gotten old answers, more bombs. But those aren't the only old answers that we're hearing. No, we're hearing answers coming, we're hearing cries louder and louder every day coming from a very old playbook. One that we seem to refer back to whenever we feel pressed. It's a knee-jerk reaction, a playbook of bigotry, a playbook of xenophobia, a playbook that even when decades later we have the decency to feel at least embarrassed about what we did, we still resort back to it the first occasion when some event somewhere turns us back into a nation of bedwetters, whining about how all of them, whoever the current them may happen to be, that all of them are out to get us. So what we're seeing now is calls for internment camps for Muslims. We have seen proposals for a national database to track all Muslims in the country all the time. We've seen demands that mosques be closed. And we have seen refugees compared to rabid dogs. We've seen governors not only declare that they will keep Syrian refugees out of their states, but at least one of them, Rick Snidely Whiplash of Indiana, has actually told a specific family to, in effect, get out of the state, even though neither he nor any of these other governors has any legal or constitutional authority to do any such thing. And we've seen, most recently, the House of Representatives overwhelmingly pass a bill whose single, sole, specific purpose is to keep Syrian refugees from entering the United States. They do this by hardening the requirements for admission under the Refugee Resettlement Program. President Obama has proposed admitting 10,000 Syrian refugees this fiscal year under this program. That's a small fraction of the hundreds of thousands which Europe is dealing with, but it is still 10,000 too many for the bigots and mouth breathers of the U.S. House of Representatives. And you need to know this. This bill was passed with the support of 47 Democrats, including a number of those who would undoubtedly claim to be liberals. 47 of them voted for this piece of xenophobic trash. Now, one way they'll justify this, you can be sure they're going to do this, is by claiming that their constituents want it. Although, frankly, what their constituents want never seems to be very important when the interest of some rich donor is involved. But they'll say their constituents want it. And in fact, according to a recent Bloomberg poll, 53% of Americans, though it seems a little odd to call them Americans since they seem to have forgotten what America's supposedly about, 53% of the people say they want these resettlement plans to be stopped. And another 11%, really letting their bigotry hang all out, said, oh, we should keep admitting Syrian refugees, provided they're Christians. Another old answer from an old playbook. Oh, but it's all for security, we'll be told. It's all for protection, because some terrorists might slip in among the refugees. We don't want to keep the refugees out. We just want to make sure there's no terrorists among them. Anyone who tries to sell you that is either lying through their teeth or has no idea what they're talking about. The refugee resettlement program involved here has been going on for about 40 years now. Over 3 million refugees have been resettled in the United States under this program. Not one of them has committed a terrorist act in or against the United States. Terrorists coming in under this program, seriously, is that what you're claiming to be worried about? Are you really going to argue that Daesh is going to try to smuggle in some terrorists through a program with background checks so extensive it takes 18 to 24 months to get through them, and which still turns away half of the applicants? Seriously? That's what you're trying to claim? Which is why this bill that's passed by the House has nothing to do with security and everything to do with blind panic. Along with, I strongly suspect, some making use of blind panic to advance their political and ideological ends. The only upside I can find here is that Senator Harry Reid has said that this bill will not pass the Senate, and while his faults, whatever they are, and they are many, he knows how to count. Oh, and by the way, that family that effectively got kicked out of Indiana, they resettled in Connecticut, where they were personally welcomed by Governor Daniel Malloy, who said that welcoming them was morally the right thing to do. They say be thankful for small favors, and these favors really are small in the face of the sweeping wave of brain-dead paranoia that's coming across our nation. But still, they are favors, and so I will be thankful. All right. Speaking of thankful, this show is going to be on the week after Thanksgiving, so it seemed the right time to engage in what has become something of a yearly tradition here, where I say, gather around, kiddies, and I'm going to tell you the real story, based on historical documents story of the first Thanksgiving. By which, of course, I do mean the event that took place in what's now Plymouth, Massachusetts in the fall of 1621, which forms the basis for our now traditional holiday. One of the reasons I do this every year, or have done it every year, is that it's truly amazing just how much misinformation, mythology, and general muddle-headedness there is about this. And I like to try to bring some hard reality to the discussion. I thought of skipping it this year because there are so many other topics to cover, from xenophobia and racism to war fever to global warming to new developments and things that I've talked about in the past, including civil asset forfeiture and the danger of tasers. But what convinced me to do it is that I sat down to watch a heavily hyped TV special on Nat Geo, the National Geographic Channel, that was supposed to be about the voyage of the Mayflower and the settling of Plymouth in 1620. The fact that it was titled by the ahistorical name Saints and Strangers put me off some, but it was supposed to be thoroughly researched, so I sat down to watch it, looking forward to it. Literally, and I do mean literally, in the first 2 minutes, there were at least 4 blatant historical errors, 2 of them significant. At that point, I gave up and decided, yes, I would do this show again. So, to start our Thanksgiving tale, consider this. This is a quote. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, so that we might after a special manner rejoice together after we gathered the fruit of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week. At which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest their greatest King Massasoit, with some 90 men, who for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation, and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others. And though it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, but by the grace of God we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. That comes from a letter dated December 11, 1621. It was written to a loving and old friend in England by Edward Winslow, a Mayflower passenger and a leader in the early years of the colony. And by the way, this painting of Winslow was done in 1651, 30-something years later, and it is the only verified picture of a Mayflower passenger known to exist. The rest of them, we have no idea what they look like. Anyway, the letter was contained in a book published in England in 1622 under the rather ponderous title of A Relation or Journal of the Beginning and Proceedings of the English Plantation Settled at Plymouth in New England by Certain English Adventurers, both Merchants and Others. The book is popularly known today by the rather less cumbersome title of Mort's Relation, and it consists of eyewitness accounts of various events during the first year of the plantation. Okay, why is that letter important? I will tell you right after the break. And we're back. All right, I mentioned that letter. Here's why that letter is important here. It is the only contemporaneous account of the so-called First Thanksgiving which is known to exist. The only other even near contemporaneous account comes from William Bradford, who was a longtime governor of the plantation, who wrote about it in his journal some 10 or 12 years after the fact, and even then he just sort of brushes by it. Here's what he said, quoting, "They now begin to gather in the small harvest they had and to fit up their houses against the winter, being all well recovered in health and strength, and had things in good plenty. For as some were thus employed in affairs abroad, others were exercised in fishing, about cod and bass and other fish, of which they took in good store, of which every family had their portion. All the summer there was no want, and now began to come in store of fowl as winter approached, of which this place did abound when they came first, but afterwards decreased by degrees. And besides waterfowl there was great store of wild turkeys, of which they took many, besides venison, etc. Besides, they had about a peck of meal a week to a person, or now since harvest Indian corn to the proportion, which made many afterwards write so large of their plenty here to their friends in England, which were not feigned but true reports." Okay, that's it. That's all of it. That's what the entire First Thanksgiving story is built on. Everything else is speculation, interpretation, and guesswork, some of that informed, a lot of it not. Now, some things we can tell from these accounts. First thing, based on other references in those same sources, we know that the event took place after September 18th and before November 9th. Most likely it was late September or the beginning of October, because that would have been shortly after harvest. In considering the event, the first thing we have to realize is that this was not a Thanksgiving as a person of the time would have understood it. And the period of Thanksgiving was a religious occasion, a day set aside for prayer to give thanks to God for some special and unexpected blessing. In fact, the first public community day of Thanksgiving in the town took place in the summer of 1623. A crop-threatening drought had led to a day of humiliation, which is a day of fasting and prayer to ask God's forgiveness for whatever they had done, for God to call such a thing down on them. And literally immediately afterwards, there started a gentle soaking rain that saved the crops, and so a day of Thanksgiving seemed appropriate. So the point is, this is not a Thanksgiving. Such days would occur occasionally as the cause arose. To plan for one in advance, especially to plan for one every year like we do now, would be regarded as a gross presumption on God's will and God's intentions. What this was instead was a very traditional, very secular English harvest feast, a celebration of a good harvest. One to which it was customary to invite those who had been helpful to you in your fields over the course of the year, which is very likely why the natives were there. They were probably invited because, yes, they had been helpful over the course of the year. Now, it's true the settlers did not have a good harvest. Remember, Bradford called it small, but they had a harvest. Now, that surely raised everyone's spirits. It probably made everyone feel like, you know what, yeah, we're going to make it, which was reason enough for a celebration, especially considering what they've been through so far. Now, I want to make a quick sidebar here to explain a rather subtle point. Europeans in the 17th century, especially the more religiously conservative sorts of the people, such as the people who led this settlement, they didn't make the sort of clear distinction between the religious and the secular, what we do today. The sense of, a feeling of, an awareness of the hand of God or the will of God in everything, in every moment, was much more central to their lives than it is to the vast majority of us now. What that means here is that the 1621 harvest feast would surely have included prayers of thanks, thanks to God, perhaps a sermon from the religious leader, Elder William Brewster. Things like that would have been significant features of the event, just as prayer would have been a frequent, significant feature of their daily lives, everything from meals to musket drills to mucking about in the fields tending their crops. However, they would not have regarded this as a day of thanksgiving as they understood the terms. While the prayers would have been a significant feature of the event, they would not have been the central feature, not have been the purpose or the driving force behind it. Celebration was. Put it yet another way. Had we been able to witness this 1621 event, to our 21st century eyes, this event, there very likely would have been more than enough praying and singing of psalms and hymns to make it look to us like a religious, or at least religiously inspired event. But to a person of the 17th century, this would have looked very secular. Anyway, back to our story. As for the eternal question of what they ate, we can be confident they had fowl, such as duck or goose. I mean, remember the governor sent 4 men on fowling specifically in preparation for this. And yes, quite possibly turkey, of which they took many, Bradford noted. They very likely also had fish, specifically cod and bass, which are also mentioned in the sources, quite possibly deer. Now, the reason I say quite possibly deer is to raise another point about the use of historical sources, how you should avoid running too far ahead of what your sources actually tell you. That is a sin of which the historical revisionists are very frequently guilty. Winslow says the natives went out and killed 5 deer, which they bestowed upon the captain, governor, and others. But we can't tell from that if the natives brought the deer in time for them to be butchered, dressed, cooked, in order to be part of the feast. Or did they bring them later as perhaps a sort of thank you, a reciprocal gift, in exchange for having been entertained and feasted? The fact is, we don't know. Bradford's mention of venison doesn't help anything because in the period, venison meant hunted meat, which includes deer, obviously, but isn't limited to it. So while they quite probably had deer, either from the natives or from their own hunting, or both, don't actually know for certain. All right, getting back to the menu, lobster and other shellfish is another real possibility. Elsewhere in that same letter that I quoted, Winslow says that they are abundant in the area, as are eels, of which Winslow says they could take a hogshead in a night. And if you think eels, you need to realize that an English person of the 17th century just would have said they're just another sort of fish. And by the way, a hogshead is a kind of cask that held 63 gallons of liquid, which means Winslow's description is probably an exaggeration, but he was like that. All right, beyond that, we can reasonably argue for some other foods, such as a sort of pie made from squash from their gardens, sweetened with dried fruit, which they would have brought from England, salad from other stuff in their gardens, and a sort of coarse cornbread. Water would have been the major and quite possibly the only beverage. Their supply of barley would be limited. Winslow says that the English corns, which are like wheat, oats, rye, and barley, he says they grew in different good, so-so, not so good. And there's no mention of hops. No hops, no beer, no barley, no ale. And even if they did have barley, it's kind of questionable if they would have had time to actually brew any ale before this feast occurred. And they did bring beer with them on the Mayflower, but it's frankly very unlikely that any of that was still there nearly a year later after their arrival. So they might have had a little ale or maybe even a little wine brought from England and saved for a special occasion, but again is most likely water. So that's pretty much it. Pretty much everything we know or can reasonably assume about the event. Not much to build a mythology on, is it? Even so, it drove the pap we got fed as school children, marked by images of picnic tables laden with turkey, mashed potatoes, and apple pie, surrounded by smiling pilgrims and natives dressed like they just came from the Great Plains, with the pilgrims dressed in the fashions of the 1690s. And the thing is, that same sparseness of detail and it's one of the reasons I actually go through this every year, that same sparseness of detail is probably a good part of the reason why the event provides so much latitude to those who want to replace the childhood and childish fantasies of noble settlers and savage natives we got fed as school children with who every year want to swap that, and instead of noble settlers and savage natives, they want to make it noble natives and savage settlers. Every year is regular as clockwork, treat us to the historical revisionism that's become as traditional as turkey and cranberry sauce. In place of the happy talk mythologies of peace, love, and harmony, we've got spoon-fed as children. We instead now find people snarling out dark tales of drunken, murderous, bloodthirsty settlers facing off with natives who were crashing the party on Thanksgiving and came in such great numbers only because they figured, Massasoit figured he'd be captured, kidnapped, or killed if he didn't. It is a vision that, as much as the earlier one, looks to replace history with ideology. It is, in other words, bunk. In point of historical fact, relations between Plymouth and the natives in the area were reasonably good for several decades. There were stresses and strains and so on, of course, but for the most part, they managed to keep together the peace treaty / mutual defense pact that they made in the spring of 1621. Things gradually got worse, and I won't go into all the reasons why, but the two main ones were population pressure and disputes over land that were rooted in vast cultural differences between the English and the natives. See, the natives had no concept of land ownership. Not just we don't own the land, or we all own the land together, or the Great Spirit owns the land. No, the idea that land was something that could be possessed didn't exist. To the natives, to own something meant you could pick it up and carry it away with you. How can you own something if you have to leave it behind anytime you go anywhere? Well, now this makes perfect sense for a semi-nomadic people who lived in one area one part of the year and another area another part of the year. But of course, to any English person, the idea of land ownership is an everyday thing. It's a commonplace. This kind of yawning cultural chasm between the two led to repeated conflict. This peace finally irrevocably broke down, but that was in 1675, more than 50 years after the so-called First Thanksgiving. The point here is that at that time, the relations were good. In fact, that Winslow letter I quoted at the top, the very next sentences of that same letter are these, and again I'm quoting, "We have found the Indians very faithful in their covenant of peace with us, very loving and ready to pleasure us. We often go to them and they come to us. Some of us have been 50 miles by land in the country with them." Winslow also says that the other native leaders in the vicinity have agreed to make peace with Plymouth on the same terms as Massasoit did, as a result of which there is now great peace amongst the Indians themselves, which was not formerly. Winslow goes on to say, and again I'm quoting, "We for our parts walk as peaceably and safely in the woods as in the highways of England. We entertain them familiarly in our houses, and they as friendly, bestowing their venison on us. They are a people without any religion or knowledge of God, yet very trusty, quick of apprehension, ripe-witted, just." And to be sure that you know, trusty means trustworthy, not trusting. And quick of apprehension does not mean quick to be apprehensive. It means quick to grasp the meaning of something. Now that does not sound either like bloodthirsty settlers looking to kill natives or natives who are afraid of any contact with those same settlers. And in fact, if you're not convinced of that, consider that in June of 1621, 3 or 4 months before this event, the town felt it necessary to send a message to Massasoit requesting that he restrain his people from coming to the settlement in such numbers. This is from Mort's relation. This is the message they sent to Massasoit, quoting, "But whereas his people came very often and very many together unto us, bringing for the most part their wives and children with them, they were welcome. Yet we being but strangers as yet at Pawtuxet alias New Plymouth, and not knowing how our corn might prosper, we could no longer give them such entertainment as we had done, and as we desired still to do." That is how afraid the natives were of the settlers. Assigning the role of angel or demon to either of these people is trash. Neither of them were angels, neither of them were demons. So I reject the revisionist history. In fact, I resent the revisionist history, first of all, because it's lousy history. It's based on ideology, not information. It looks to satisfy the demands of politics, not of scholarship. And it's every bit as full of false tables and mythology as the nonsense and pap we got fed as schoolchildren. Plymouth in the fall of 1621 was a place of genuinely peaceful and friendly relations, of good feeling between the settlers and the nearby natives. The first Thanksgiving was a moment of celebration when everyone on both sides, even if they were still wary of each other, everyone on both sides was thinking, yeah, this is going to work out. Now that wasn't going to happen. It was a false hope, even a foolish hope. And it was a brief enough moment, lasting even by the most generous interpretation, no more than a few decades. It was a rare enough moment in our nation's history of cruelty toward and genocide of the native peoples of North America that while the first Thanksgiving should not be a source of happily ever after, why can't we just all get along fairy tales, neither is there any need to co-opt it into the service of an ideologically driven revisionism. Because that moment of hope did exist, and frankly, I resent the attempt to strip away that moment of hope in pursuit of a modern political agenda. I remember a friend of mine some years ago talking about the drive to find angelic forces in the world, the idea that the seeming need so many of us have to find some people, some force, some movement, something whose motives are always and completely pure. In our attempts to find some better balance in our understanding of what was done to the native peoples of North America, the cruelties inflicted on them, the racism and bigotry directed toward them. Too many of us, in considering the so-called pilgrims of Plymouth, have chosen to simply swap one mythology for another, perhaps more satisfying, but no less false one. Balance, it seems, is still a long way off. So, anyway, I hope you enjoyed your Turkey Day. I hope you got the chance to spend time with family or friends, or better yet, both. And I hope you can understand why I celebrate Thanksgiving not as an expression of thankfulness for the past or even the present, but as an expression of hope for the future. That hope, too, may prove as foolish as that of 1621, and these days I often think that it is. But the blunt fact is, hope is also the absolute indispensable requirement for any effort to make that future a better one. You have the best week you possibly can. We will talk to you next week. For now, peace.